Hello everyone, hello and welcome to Ask Ethys, the show where we answer any of your Final Fantasy XIV lore questions within reason, to what I can only hope is a reasonable level of satisfaction. This week, of course, we are somewhat hyperfixated on the Endwalker showcase and trailer, and today's questions will be reflecting this to no one's great surprise, although we are going to be trying to balance, once again, the more descriptive answers with speculation. As usual, I'm taking these questions from the patrons and Twitch subs channel of our community Discord server, so if you would like to have a question featured on this show, then there are some links in the description below as to how you might go about facilitating that. We have a number of questions here about the island Thavnair and its city-state Radz-at-Han, to no great surprise, as that has of course been confirmed as one of the city hubs that we will be visiting in Endwalker, as well as Greater Thavnair being one of the zones which we will be exploring. So I'm going to start with level 39 Nerd, who asks, Radz-at-Han will be one of the new locations, home to dancers and alchemists alike. What and who do we know from there, and who might be our liaison to get there? Now, I actually have several pages of notes here compiled on Thavnair and Radz-at-Han in anticipation of a video that I'm going to be making on everything we know about that place. So for today, rather than just rambling on for 45 minutes about Thavnair, I'm going to try to answer these questions a little more directly. As for who we know from Radz-at-Han, we have, of course, the Troop Falcium, practitioners of the Kriegstands dance, as well as Jalzahn from the A Realm Reborn relic questline, and Ardashir from the Heavensward Anima questline. Perhaps more notable for the MSQ, we have Minfilia's adoptive mother, Flamin, whom is not from Thavnair, but has spent a great deal of time in Radz-at-Han with Troop Falcium specifically. And after the events of 2.55 and the Bloody Banquet with the Scions hunted, Flamin actually fled back to Radz-at-Han, accompanied by Hori Boulder and Coltene from the Scions B team, where they actually completed the Trials of the Zodiac Braves, which is basically a series of trials that we emulated for our A Realm Reborn relic questline. So they spent a good bit of time there getting buff, and Coltene actually is thought to be subsequently developing new arcane arts based on Near Eastern arcane knowledge. I've seen some speculation online that note about Coltene studying in Radz-at-Han might have actually led to the Sage job, but I don't think so. I think Sage is very self-evidently of Sharlayan origin and Sharlayan design. And you know what? We're probably going to end up diving into that in a couple of minutes here. Carver Yane of the Kraken's Arms actually does a fair bit of trade in and out of Radz-at-Han, as far as we know. So as for who might be our liaison to get there, that is certainly a possibility. But it's important to note here that although Radz-at-Han is neutral and has a non-aggression treaty with the Garleans, they are not as closed off as, Hingashi, for instance, through Kugane. Actually, speaking of Kugane, I think it would be a missed opportunity for us not to end up in Radz-at-Han, at least without taking a bit of a detour to the Thavnarian consulate over in Kugane, which I'm sure you guys have seen there. It's actually very, very close to the Garlean consulate, which we have also not been yet chance and opportunity to peek inside. As for liaisons, I don't think we're going to be getting to Radz-at-Han through contact so much as we're going to be getting there through necessity, by which I mean I'm pretty sure that one of Fandaniel's towers is going to have cropped up somewhere on Thavnair and is going to be a huge part of the action of Endwalker for us to be traveling the world to deal with those in one way or another. Continuing on the subject of Radz-at-Han, Kuro Maboroshi actually asks a very good question here. With Thavnair just north of some rather infamously dangerous waters, specifically the Siren Song Sea, have we ever been given a reason as to why sailors don't use Radz-at-Han as a a pit stop during months-long journey from Eorzea to Othard and vice versa to avoid the Siren Song Sea. Doesn't seem like it would cost much time. Is it too close to Garlean territorial waters? And you've basically put your finger on it right there. Thavnair is traditionally this kind of central trading hub and, as you say, a pit stop between the three great continents, and its culture and its wealth is kind of built off that fact, off that geographical location, both for its trade opportunities, but also for this kind of central equatorial location in the Bounty, the sea in which it sits being incredibly rich and abundant with life. The strait between the north of Thavnair and the mainland of southern Ilsabard, the Corvos Narrow, I'm sure you guys have all seen it on the map, but I'll put it up here for you, has been for thousands of years a very common thoroughfare for trade vessels. And according to legend, there was actually once a giant statue that stood astrode the Narrow with 1 foot on Ilsabard and 1 foot on Thavnair, very much evocative of the Colossus at Rhodes, which is now destroyed, and we are told at least that there are the ruins of a foot on Ilsabard and a foot on Thavnair. But to this day, sailors traveling through that strait, the Corvos Narrow, still refer to it quite colorfully as scratching the crotch. To answer your question though, Kuro, when we were traveling through the Siren Song Sea with Corvain in Stormblood, we were heading to Doma via Kugane to there instigate a revolution, and to ensure the efficacy of that quest, we were trying to remain as far off the Garlean radar, and Radz-at-Han as a neutral territory with Garlemald, with trade relationships, would have had quite a large Garlean presence. Kuro also asks here, Radz-at-Han seems to harbor vast quantities of crystal on a scale we'd so far only expect in Eorzea, and I assume you're referring to these screenshots and concept art that I'll put up here from the showcase. As they try to remain on trading or at least neutral terms with all nations of Hydaelyn, including the Empire, do we have any indication as to why the Garleans did not try to subjugate them? With the Matanga confirmed as a native beast tribe and all those crystals, it would seem like another hotspot for primal summonings. Now, I'll try to break this down. First, in regard to those crystals, what we're looking at there, although it looks very, very much like ether crystals, is actually not, as far as we know. It is actually a stone called Giant's Gall, which is much denser than even most metals. It's almost like a diamond-like substance as opposed to an ether-rich crystal. And I think Mary was the first person to correctly identify this on Twitter once we saw these screenshots, so shout out to Mary for that catch. Basically, in 1.0, Giant Skull weapons were a skirmish reward, and I've got some flavor text here for you from 1.0. The stone Giant Skull is found only on Thavnair, possessing exceptional hardness. Its name is derived from the legend of a Far Eastern hero who voyaged to the island and vanquished a savage giant. A nearby stone drank up the giant's blood and gall, receiving its strength. So again, it looks like a crystal, it looks like something that you would be able to use to summon primals, but as far as we know, it is not. It is still an extremely useful and valuable material, but not necessarily something that can be producing Matanga primals willy-nilly. Now that said, we do see in the concept art in Thavnair there what seems to be a pretty large statue of Asura, right? Which, well, I'm sure I don't need to tell you to read between the lines there. Speaking of the Matanga, although the Matanga are an intelligent spoken race, they have an extremely difficult to understand language and are quite often mistaken as being, dull-witted and far more bestial than they actually are. And the Garleans did actually subjugate the Matanga in large numbers to use them as slave labor, in much the same way as the Thorn dynasty in Uldar did with the Hecaton Kire Gigas. The Matanga that we see on the Azim Steppe are actually a group that escaped from imperial captivity and managed to flee to the east. We're told that in Near Eastern history, the Matanga have actually been very often used as slave soldiers by Near Eastern warlords, including those from Thavnair and Radz-at-Han, that basically beefed them up on various alchemical concoctions and used them as cannon fodder, effectively. As for why the Garleans didn't try to subjugate Thavnair, well, we're told that canonically people have theories that they wanted to keep their options open to be able to acquire goods from Eorzea, as well as no doubt Mericidia, with which Radz-at-Han is the only nation state in the world to maintain any kind of trade or diplomatic relationship. In more practical terms, my guess would be that it's a kind of divide and conquer scenario, right? Where Garlemald is quite happy to keep Radz-at-Han and Shali and Hingashi, these island city-states at the extremes of the three great continents, on a leash, relatively placated until they have conquered all of the three great continents, after which no doubt they would be turning their attention to these places. So it's not so much a case of the Garleans never had any interest in subjugating Thavnair, it was that they hadn't gotten around to subjugating Thavnair just yet. I could honestly talk about Thavnair and Radz-at-Han for a long time, and I probably will when we do this Thavnairian video, but something that I'm really fascinated about and really eager to investigate, which I will leave you guys with, is the fact that Radz-at-Han is actually thousands of years old, that it survived at least the 6th Umbral Calamity, which means that its current state was at least contemporary with the 5th Astral Era Eorzean nation states like Amdapor, Mark, Nim, Scar, and the clay idol that we fight for, I think the first boss in the Scala dungeon, is believed to have been of Near Eastern origin and is almost definitely from Radz-at-Han. And I think that we could learn an awful lot to kind of stop the gaps in our knowledge of the 5th Astral Era from that place, if not even knowledge from the 4th Astral Era, which so far we know absolutely nothing. So I think we have a lot of reasons to be excited to visit Thavnair. So that's probably enough about Thavnair and Radz-at-Han for the moment. I'm more than happy to answer more questions about Thavnair in future episodes, but like I say, I'm working on a video about everything we know about those places so far, so I hope you look forward to that. And maybe if there are any more questions that come up after you've seen that, then we can tackle them here in this format from that point. Miriana's got a good question here, actually, about the moon and lunar cults, and I'm sure you guys remember last time we were talking a little bit about the Lambs of Dalamud, and it seems like these kinds of beliefs, these kinds of philosophies are going to have a very interesting tie into Endwalker, perhaps even more so than we were originally thinking, now that we've seen the trailer. So Miriana asks, between the connections of our Warrior in Light to Azem and Azem to Azim/Azema, it seems that we may be heading toward further delving into the 12 as we uncover ancient secrets and pal around with the Society of Scholars in Sharlayan. Okay, I agree with that. I think you're probably right. We've been fed the links between the moon and Zodiac/his followers for a while, but if we dig into the 12, we also have Menfina as a goddess of the moon. Do we know anything regarding her lore or connections to the convocation that might tie into concepts we know of in Endwalker so far? And as an addendum here, Miriana says, selfishly, at the very least, I would hope Menfina talk would give us more Keeper of the Moon NPCs of note. Now, Miriana, I hate to say it, but I gotta disappoint you here. We know very, very little about Menfina. In fact, we know very, very little about any of the 12. We have this sort of Eorzean creation myth, but beyond that, they are extremely esoteric beings. In the Eorzean creation myth, we have first Alphic, the god of time and space, and Nemea, the spinner of fate, and their first children are the sun and the moon, Azema and Menfina. So at least in the Eorzean creation myth, Menfina is made out to literally be the moon, but also the keeper of the twin moons, the main one, Menfina, and of course Dalamud, her loyal hound. Now, as you've noticed here, the connection between Azema, the sun god of Eorzea, and Azim, the sun god of the Zayla, it's kind of surprising to me that it's Menfina and not Nemea that represents the sun in Eorzean myth, because, you know, you would have that connection between Nemea and Nama, who represents the sun for the Zayla culture. You're wondering about connections between the 12 and the Convocation, and I think that is the right question to be asking. It seems at this point that the 12 probably were originally the companions of Thavnair for the most part, this counter-convocation that basically decided to summon Hydaelyn, with the notable exception, of course, of Azem, who was opposed to both the summoning of Zodiac and Hydaelyn, and seems that they were kind of thrust into this role of Warrior of Light by necessity to try and fix the mistakes of their compeers on both sides of that argument. Once again, we talked last time about the Lambs of Dalamud and about the Zayla and their moon cults, and I'm sure that that is going to come back into a certain degree of significance. And I think you're probably right that we will learn something about Menphina, or that Menphina will at least come up somewhere in Endwalker. But for the time being, she is inextricably mysterious, and unfortunately, I hate to say, I can give you very, very little information on Menphina. So I'm sorry about that, Miriana, but I'm certainly smelling what you're stepping in there, and I'm definitely on board with learning more about Menphina and the rest of the 12 coming into Endwalker. And I'm sure at this point we have to, right? It's one of the last big mysteries remaining in this whole Hydaelyn, Zodiac, Scions and Ascians plotline that we've been hurtling towards the conclusion of far more rapidly, actually, than we had previously expected. Now, as we're diving into more Eorzean lore, as opposed to the lore of other places across Hydaelyn and the Shards, which I'm honestly, really excited to revisit in Endwalker, Aisling asks, since it makes an appearance in the trailer and is still one of the prettiest locations in the game, I agree, what do we know of the ancient city of Nim? Who were they, and what happened to them? Yeah, so as we were actually just describing in relation to Radz-at-Han probably being contemporary with these nation-states, Nim was the nation-state on Vilbrand during the 5th Astral Era, and was one of only 3 states to survive to the end of that era in Eorzea, alongside Amdapor of the White Mages and Mark of the Black Mages, which as far as we know basically wiped the other 9 nation-states off the map over the course of the last handful of centuries of the 5th Astral Era. So Nim is where we get our scholar tradition from, the tradition that we play as a job, as opposed to, Sharlayan scholars or contemporary Eorzean scholars. And the Nimian scholars were, of course, the progenitors of modern Arcanima, of modern arcanists. And their fairies, these arcane entities, were basically a more nuanced and sophisticated version of the carbuncles that we have now. Nim was also very thalassocratic in the same way that Limsa is, which was no doubt facilitated by its geographical location. And although they had a much smaller standing military than either Amdapor or Mark, they survived ostensibly due to the superior tactical reasoning of the Nimian scholars. Now, in the waning years of the 5th Astral Era, they suffered, as far as we know, 2 major attacks by the Marquis Black Mage, one of which we know for certain, and one of which we can kind of piece together. So the first was the summoning of an invisible void scent named Bitoso, which carried this horrible plague, which transformed a large part of the Nimian population into tonberries before they were quarantined within the Wanderer's Palace, and we all know how that turned out. And secondly, and this is not confirmed in text, but very evident in fighting Ozma, was the deployment of Ozma to kind of take a large chunk out of the floating city of Nim. So this location that we're seeing Alphinaud and Alizé fighting in the trailer, basically, it's became what it looks like now as a result of Ozma being sent there to take a huge chunk out of it, which is still in that weird little pocket dimension of Ozma that we actually get sucked into ourselves in fighting Ozma in the Yafayam Saltmore. As for what happened to them, we know that the 5th Astral Era culminated in the Great Flood, the 6th Umbral Calamity that basically drowned all of Eorzea except for the peaks of Blathia's spine. And Nim, unfortunately, was no exception. They forged a grand company and initiated Operation Maelstrom, after which, of course, the Maelstrom of Limsa is now named, where they basically deployed a fleet around Vilbrand, setting up these arcane barriers, which they were very, very much hoping would save them from the floodwaters. And by floodwaters, I should clarify that what we actually mean is incessant pounding tsunamis for days and weeks and months on end. And although Nim did not survive, descendants of the Nimians presumably did throughout the Ciudades, as the plainsfolk, Lalafels, that slowly made their way back to Vilbrand after the first several centuries of the 6th Astral Era. As for what exactly Alphino, Alize, and the Warrior of Light are doing at the ruins of Nim in the trailer, it is, of course, right underneath one of the towers that appeared in 5.4, which is no doubt going to be a major crux of the action of Endwalker. So to speak to that, albeit slightly indirectly, Level 39 Nerd asks, Anima is most famous for being in Final Fantasy X. How does the lore of Anima in Final Fantasy X may or may not fit into Final Fantasy XIV? So as I'm sure is very clear now, if it wasn't before, Daniel is trying to recreate the final days, right? The apocalypse that befell Amarot. And what that apocalypse looked like was the spontaneous and uncontrollable summoning of these terminus beasts as the ancients lost control of their creation magics, which were basically, for lack of a better term, primal forms of their fears and terrors and anxieties. The models of the monsters that we see the party fighting in the trailer are usually void scents that are summoned into the corpses of dragons that are left around. I think the first place we fought one of these, at least in ARR, would have been Amdapor Keep. Actually, that's not true. They were in a couple of guild leaves, but for most people it would have been Amdapor Keep. But these ones specifically, and this specific skin is actually something that we were fighting in Amarot, in the dungeon of Emet-Selk's recreation of the final days of Amarot. So these same kinds of terminus beasts are appearing in Eorzea and across Hydaelyn, no doubt facilitated by these towers. And for my money, the same way that the Light Wardens were basically these superpowered Sin Eaters that provided the kind of main antagonistic forces for Shadowbringers, and the main plot trajectory for 5.0 was traveling through Novrant to take out these Light Wardens. And I think something very similar is going to happen in Edgewalker, where these towers are going to be scattered around the world, and for each of them there is going to be a singular and singularly powerful Terminus Beast. And I think Anima is going to be one of those. She certainly fits it aesthetically. As for a deeper lore for Anima, I won't spoil it for those of you who haven't played Final Fantasy X, but Anima, who she was before she became this monster, is something of great significance to the plot of Final Fantasy X, and that certainly may be the case for Final Fantasy XIV as well. I would certainly be interested to see them explore that. But for the most part, I think Anima is going to represent for us in 14 one of these prime, singular, 8-man trial terminus beasts, effectively. I'm going to take just a couple more questions, actually, from Level 39 Nerd here, so shout out to Level 39 Nerd for being the absolute MVP for today's video. Nerd asks, let's talk about Scythes and some job speculations. Now, to put this in context, I think we've basically all decided by now and all more or less agree that the new job is going to be a scythe-wielding melee DPS. Between Yoshida's shirts and the things that he was saying in interviews after the showcase, I think that's a pretty safe bet. So the question is, can you tell us where in 14 we've seen NPCs and enemies wield scythes or similar weapons? Could any of these hint at abilities that we might use? And yeah, absolutely. I mean, Edda uses a scythe, Fadiad and several other Void Sent use a scythe, but most notably, and something that a lot of people have indeed noticed, is of course Ranjit. And Ranjit had these two different forms, one of which was a scythe-wielding melee DPS. Now, how that worked for Ranjit, I don't think is going to be the same as how it works for this, let's call it working title, Reaper melee DPS in Edgewalker. Ranjit had this dragon familiar, which a lot of people saw and thought, oh, that's, Beastmaster, Dragon Tamer, something to that effect. Gukumat seems to be something more like a blood eggy It's either an arcane entity that is formed out of Ranjit's blood as a source of ether. So kind of like a carbuncle, but rather than using a stone or a crystal for the source, it's actually using his blood. Or else it is a draconic beast that is bound to Ranjit through his blood, forming this kind of soul link. So as a result, Ranjit's got these two forms. He's got his kind of like monk form with this pet that he controls basically telepathically. And then he's got his scythe-wielding form where he actually fuses with Gukumats, and you see it sort of almost like form part of his body and actually forms his scythe. His scythe seems to be made partly out of the body of Gukumats. And as interesting as it may seem to have a melee DPS that has this kind of like pet class aspect to it that would be like really, really unique among the melee DPS, knowing or at least very strongly suspecting as we do that Xenos is going to be picking up this new job. Again, we're going to be doing a trailer breakdown where I'm going to go into this in a little bit more depth, but we have a very strong reason to believe that we can actually see a scythe leaning against the side of Xenos' throne there. I would be so incredibly surprised if Xenos picked up a pet job. It just doesn't really seem his style. And it seems like a pretty arbitrary reason for us to like exclude ourselves from having a melee pet job. But for my money, I think we're going to be seeing a lot of the same animations that we see Ranjit using in that form. But beyond that, I do think it's going to behave quite differently. So I'm going to take one more question here, once again from level 39 Nerd, which has absolutely been bringing it, who starts by saying, okay, moon talk, I'm sorry. It's okay, Nerd, we're going to the moon, I just have to accept it. Alaga's built spaceships, Omega and Midi's brood have traversed space, the Garleans have certainly toyed with moons before, how the hell are we getting up there? Will Tataru just show up and be like, I built you a spaceship? Will Sid? Are we hijacking an old Allagan rocket? I hadn't actually entertained this idea before, but we know that Tataru has very recently built an airship, and I personally am not terribly fond of the idea that she's going to make that space-worthy. So I think we've actually got a pretty major hint for this in the logo of Endwalkers. The large tower that you see stretching up from Hydaelyn or the moon or both, intersected as they are, looks very much like the Allagan starships that you're mentioning. It actually appears to be an Allagan Ragnarok class starship. And how do we know what these look like? Well, they are actually the coils of Bahamut. Dalamud was made up of a bunch of these starships kind of threaded together with this sort of carapace, this chassis built around them. They were all kind of like repurposed into the construction of Dalamud. And when Dalamud blew apart, it's those that kind of dropped like these big sort of pillars into the land. We saw one obviously in the Answers trailer, we see one in Eastern Thanalan, we see one in the Shroud there. They're all over the place. And it's not inconceivable, I suppose, that, you know, with Sid and Nero, I mean, they've done time travel, right? They teleported the Crystal Tower to another shard. Well, they didn't, but, you know, they did the maths, and then their children's children, you know, completed the engineering work. But that's besides the point. I think it's certainly within the realm of possibility that we actually restore one of the coils and take it up to the moon. If not that, then I see a lot of people entertaining the possibility, which I think is quite compelling, that, you know, not all of the Allagans were landlocked when the fourth Umbral Calamity went down. Then maybe there was a crew up in space in one of these Ragnaroks, and maybe they couldn't get back down to Earth. Maybe they crash landed into the moon, and you know, rather than just seeing a big barren rock with a couple of ruins and a couple of statues to Zodiac, we're actually going to find something of a civilization up on the moon as the progeny of survivors of an Allagan Ragnarok crew. I think would be quite compelling. So it's either that or we take the Bonanza. Which do you think is more compelling from a narrative perspective? Well, I'm sure you can guess how I feel. Anyway, I think this is probably going to be a pretty long one. We'll have to see once I'm done editing it. But if it is significantly longer than the last couple of parts, I apologize for that. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't apologize for that. Maybe you guys like it when they're longer. I don't know. This is only the third one that we've done. If you have any feedback for me, I would greatly appreciate it. I'm sure it's obvious that we're still kind of like feeling out the format, feeling out the space and the setup. I'm using a different camera that I've been using the last couple of times, which I think doesn't look quite as good, but it's got a dummy battery, which means that I can do all of this in one sitting rather than having to recharge the battery for 2 hours and then come back and do the second half of it. So I'm working hard to kind of improve the workflow for Ask Ethys, because the whole point of this series is that they were going to be like easy to film and easy to produce. And I think ultimately that is going to be the case once we work out the workflow. But so far that hasn't been quite the case insofar as I was hoping. So we still got a few things to kind of iron out there, and hopefully when we do, we'll be able to smash them out at a pretty good pace when we don't have other stuff to work on. Speaking of other stuff to work on, I am, of course, as I mentioned, doing a trailer breakdown. I'm doing a video on Thavnair, everything we know about Thavnair and Radz-at-Han, which I'm sure will bring up more questions for you guys that we can address in this space. And also talking about Sage. I saw a couple of questions which I didn't actually have time to get to, asking about Sage and where Sage has been referenced. And obviously there's a lot of Sage references in Sharlayan. Kind of long answer short, Sage is kind of like Scholar, in that there's a huge disconnect between professional scholars and scholars as like a job, as a martial kind of archetype. And we'll be churning through that in another video. So again, if that brings up more questions, we can use this space to address those questions. But for now, thank you very, very much for watching. Thank you so much for the questions. Twitch subs and patrons, guys, thank you so much for the support. Obviously, it means the world to me. Not only the fact that you help me feed myself and pay the bills, but also that you're like collaborating on this series in a really meaningful way, asking some really, really great questions, and I really, really appreciate that. Once again, if you guys have questions that you would like to see answered in this format, in this series, then I will be prioritizing people that fall into those categories. So if you would like to consider supporting the channel through one of those means, I would really appreciate it. There's going to be lots more stuff coming down the pipeline as we learn more about Endwalker, no doubt. So I hope you keep an eye on the channel for all of that. And if you're not subscribed, then please consider doing so. And if you are subscribed and don't have notifications enabled and don't want to miss any of these videos or any of the other Endwalker stuff we're going to be digesting, then just hit that little bell below the video and you'll get those notifications, and it won't get buried in the awful YouTube algorithm. I think that's enough shilling, so here it is. Here's the outro, here's the music, and shout out of course to Pascalus for said music. Check out his stuff, links in the description below. Thank you all very much one more time, and goodbye.